This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
So now we're going to look at SWOT analysis, objectives, critical success factors and benchmarking. So far we've looked at external factors such as pastel and 5 forces. We looked at internal factors such as value chain, resources, competences. Those can be brought together in a SWOT analysis, something which summarizes the strengths and weaknesses, and they tend to be internal, and the opportunities and threats which are external. So examples of strengths and weaknesses: we might be very good in terms of finance and our financial resources, but we might be weak in marketing. We might be strong in terms of our abilities of the staff. Our human resources might be very, very strong, but our IT system might be old and creaking. That would be a weakness. Outside the organisation, we can see opportunities and threats. So a typical threat might be a large competitor deciding to start up and maybe cut prices. We have to think how we're going to respond to that. Whereas an opportunity might be a large competitor getting into financial difficulties, and maybe the opportunity is that we can take them over or eliminate them in some way. Again, the emphasis should be on not just categorizing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. It should be thinking, and so what? What sort of action should we take to make the best of this? Putting in this sort of diagram here, so-called TOWS, as it's sometimes called, matrix, is quite a good way. And all it is saying really is, look, if you, for example, were particularly good in your finance, if you had lots and lots of spare cash around, that's your strength. And the opportunity was that you had a competitor who is in great financial difficulty. That is a kind of marriage made in heaven, because you have the money, your competitor needs the money. You could probably take them over at maybe quite a cheap price. That's going to work really, really well. Or your strength might be you're really good at marketing. The opportunity is that you've been approached maybe by a distributor in another country who's saying, why don't you try selling your product here? You have got experience in international marketing, so that's going to work very well. You have the strength in terms of marketing, international exposure. The opportunity is a country where you are not so far selling to. If there is a weakness, however, and an opportunity, then you can't really exploit the opportunity immediately. It'd be a bit like saying we've got no cash in the bank, but the opportunity is that we take over a competitor. It's not going to work. Or there's no point in trying to expand abroad if you have got no international marketing experience. So either you have to abandon that opportunity, or what you have to do is to make good the weakness. So if you hadn't any money in the bank, you wanted to take over a company, then maybe what you need is a rights issue, or you need to borrow money from the bank, but you can't take them over if you don't have the money. Similarly, if you wanted to expand abroad and you didn't have any international experience, perhaps what you need to do is to recruit an experienced international marketing person who can help you. This one here, there is a threat, and we might be able to fight it with a strength. So maybe a threat comes from a new competitor who started up, and your strength is your brand name, a reputation for really very, very good quality and so on. You can play to try to maximize what people feel about your brand name, really make it work for you there. And this could make it very difficult for this upstart to come in and to try to steal market share. So using your strength to try to defeat a threat. It could be money. Maybe the threat is, again, a competitor opening up. You've got lots of money in the bank. You just reduce your selling prices by 25% for 6 months, whatever length of time it takes, until you cause this competitor to retreat, having been defeated. This is the tricky one here. There is a threat, and it's kind of focused on where you are weak. An example, I probably said in E2 as well. UK car industry had in the 1960s and maybe 1970s dreadful reputation for quality. and the threat was basically Japanese car manufacturing companies. And they came in with great quality, new designs and so on. And really the British car industry didn't stand a chance. We have a big car industry now, but it's mostly Japanese companies who have set up manufacturing businesses in the UK. So here, really all they could do, they tried various things, but very unsuccessfully, is to look for a strategy which avoids the threats, and in their case it was actually closed down. They had no strategy available which would repair the dreadful reputation most of the mass car manufacturers had in the UK. They simply had to go out of business. Now when you get to the SWOT analysis, we have essentially done the first part of the rational plan. We've looked at the position analysis. We have the mission, the stakeholders. We've looked externally, PESTEL, 5 forces. We've looked internally at resources and competences. We've maybe summarised them on the SWOT analysis. We know what might be possible. And the next step that came in the rational model was objectives. Most people say that objectives have to be smart objectives, whereas goals and visions and so on are a bit hazy. We want to be the best in the world, or we want to conquer the world with our product, or something like that. By the time you get down to objectives, they are terribly precise. So they must be very specific. You can't just say, I'm going to be a better company. You have to say, it has to be profits, it has to be quality, whatever it's going to be. It has to be measurable. So you have to say, I want my profits to increase by 10%. You should believe that it's achievable, and in particular your employees, the people who are charged with meeting this objective, also have to believe it's possible. Ideally it's achievable, it's agreed with them, it's accepted by people as being a valid target to aim for. It has to be relevant. The people to whom you give the targets must be able to affect them in some way. It must be relevant to them, but also it should be relevant to the mission of the business. So if your mission, if you're a hospital and your mission was to make people better, if you give people objectives, then they must kind of see a pathway through. If I do this, or I hit this objective, then maybe we'll be able to see more patients and I will cure more people and so on. That it is kind of coherent with the mission of the organisation. Otherwise, people suspect they've been given objectives for no reason other than to kind of make them jump through hoops to the kind of pleasure of the manager. And finally, it is going to be time limited. You have to achieve the objectives within a particular period. Very often it's a year. That's when most budget periods are for. But sometimes it may have to be on a monthly basis, maybe hit a sales target for each of the months. Objectives can be arrived at in a way in two different directions. There can be top-down objectives, where management kind of impose objectives on staff, although ideally it should be kind of agreed and accepted there rather than just kind of landing on your desk, and you can be a bit outraged at that. Or it can be bottom up, where you ask your staff to suggest objectives. It doesn't mean you completely accept them. There may be an element of challenge in those objectives. It's the same way really that budgets can sometimes be set. You can have a top-down budgeting system or a bottom-up budgeting system, but really whatever the direction is, to make it effective, there ought to be really some sort of communication, some sort of discussion and explanation about why the objective is what it is. Problems with objectives: you need to make sure they are vertically consistent. So if this had 2 subsidiaries and this one made 5 and this one made 4, there's no point in saying we want the overall profit to be 10. It simply doesn't stack up. So something has to give there. So to be vertically consistent, you'd say the group profit's going to be 9. It has to be horizontally consistent. So if your sales are 1,000 and your manufacturing is only 800, that's not going to work. Unless you can source from outside, it simply doesn't work. And then you need to be time consistent here. There's no point in having a gross profit percentage, kind of 40% and then 20% and then kind of 55%, you kind of have it whizzing up and down all over the place. It's illogical. It'd be alright maybe going 40, 42, 45 in a pattern, but to have it going all over the place, people know that it's excessively arbitrary. You also need to make sure that to keep an eye on how many objectives there are. We've said before in these lectures that whatever you measure, you change. Basically, what people do is they know if they're given an objective, they're going to be judged on that objective. The bonus may depend on that objective, and it means all of the other desirable kind of traits of behavior kind of recede into the background. So what you need to do is to give objectives in all the areas where people need to perform well. So it could be sales volume, it could be gross profit percentage, it could be customer satisfaction and so on. If you were just to concentrate on sales volume, salespeople could achieve that by reducing the price outrageously. The gross profit would be hurt, but of course they weren't given an objective for that. Interdependencies. You have to be careful, particularly when maybe appraising people afterwards to see if they've met the objective, is whether or not they were actually the cause of missing the objective. You see it in variance analysis. So you can have a material price variance, which is favourable, and that could cause a usage variance, which is adverse. The price variance is favourable because the buyer is buying cheap rubbish. This is given to people in production, and of course they have to use far more of this cheap rubbish because so much of it has to be kind of thrown away because it's not capable of really being used. So we need to watch for that. Long-term, short-term conflicts, really big problem in objectives. Certainly for companies which are listed on the stock exchange, there is huge short-term pressure each year to perform well. Dividends increase, earnings per share increases and so on. Newspapers comment on the results and so on. And the temptation is you take decisions which are good in the short term but are bad in the long term. For example, just for one, you reduce research and development. That's normally written off against profit. If you don't spend anything in research and development, it will increase this year's profit. But of course, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, you've got no new products coming online. Your competitors' products are more modern and are beating yours. Long term, it could be actually deadly to the company. So we need to find some way of balancing these long-term, short-term objectives and pressures. And finally, it's not really a problem with objectives, it's just kind of a warning. It says here, not all desirable attributes are easy to measure, but if it's a desirable attribute, if it's a desirable way of behaving, it makes no sense not to measure it. So if you are in hospitality business, tourism, hotels, restaurants and so on, then you could argue that staff morale is a desirable attribute because you want staff to be, in a way, happy, friendly, in a good mood. Because we've all been greeted by grumpy staff in restaurants and so on, and it hurts the experience. So if it's important to have staff who are fairly happy, then you should measure it. It makes no sense to say it's important for staff to have high morale and then not try to assess it. It's illogical. It may be difficult to measure it, but make an attempt. Even get the staff to fill in an assessment form. Get customers to fill in an assessment form. Look at staff turnover, how often people leave. Look at sick time and so on. These are often correlated to staff morale. But if it's important, you should set objectives. Now, what's likely to happen, of course, if you are setting lots of objectives and all sorts of desirable attributes, you're going to end up with lots and lots and lots of them. You could easily have 50, 60 different objectives over the various departments in the organisation. And of course, 50 or 60 different objectives, quite hard to keep your eye on, really. And this is where critical success factors come in. And this is like almost a ranking of your objectives. These are the really important ones. The ones, as it says here, where you must perform well if you are to succeed at all. How do we know what those are? Well, this first definition gives us a little bit of help here. It's a bit longer, a bit harder, but it's actually more useful. It says a critical success factor are those products and features that are particularly valued by a group of customers. Because if they're particularly valued by a group of customers, that's what you want. You want to please your customers, and therefore the organisation must excel to outperform the competition. So it might be quality, that might be your critical success factor, or one of them. It might be cost per unit. It might be always being able to deliver the product within 2 hours. That might be the critical success factor. It might be the way you please your customer is to never run out of stock. You have all sorts of obscure inventory there, and you can always go to them because they're guaranteed to have items in inventory. Whatever it is, it really gets back to value chain. Understand what it is that turns your customers on, because making profits depends on happy customers and pleasing your customers so that they come to you rather than go somewhere else. Now, the critical success factors can be all sorts of things. Here's just a list here. It could be profitability. It could be your market share, for example. That could be critical because you want to have a very dominant market share to get low cost per unit and so on there. It could be productivity to keep your cost per unit down because you're under very fierce cost competition. Maybe it's not so much productivity as being rather more innovative, product leadership, always bringing out very well engineered products. People are always wanting to see what the next one being launched is going to be, a bit like Apple does perhaps. It could be more to do with your personnel, that we need to make sure they're trained, that they're kept up to date. If you're in a professional business, then they can continued professional development, continued professional education, so people keep up to date with accounting standards, auditing standards, technical standards and so on. Could be absolutely key to the success of your business. It could be employee attitudes, morale we talked about, that they appear to be happy, keen, enthusiastic, and this passes on to the customers. Some organisations are going to be public responsibility. They like to present themselves as being a good corporate citizen, so to speak, and the sort of customers or interactions with the public they have, they feel it's important that they can not quite boast, but to be able to report on high levels of maybe corporate social responsibility. And again, as we've mentioned, there's balance between long-term and short-term goals. At the end of the day, we're after sustainable, long-term competitive advantage, sustainable success. But obviously, from time to time, short-term goals become very important. It may be short-term very important that we don't breach an overdraft limit. We might have to cut that research and development to stay within the overdraft limit. And that might be the better decision to make in that situation, even though we're going to have to sort out what we're going to be doing in a few years' time with regard to new products. Sources, here I'll just look at a couple of these here. Structure of the industry. If you're in a very competitive industry, then this might be suggesting that your cost per unit, your cost base, is going to be very important in your critical success. Your competitive strategy. Are we going to be competing by innovation or by some other mechanism of competition? Industry position. If we're a very small player in an industry, then probably it's going to be hard for us to get our cost per unit down. So that's not what allows us to survive. Maybe what allows us to survive is to say, look, we're a very small share. We have a very small share in this industry. You're our main customer. We're going to look after you really well. And okay, our cost might be a little bit higher, but to us, you are a big fish. Whereas to one of these large players in the industry with their kind of 40% shares, you are just a very small player. So we'll look after you really well. It could be environmental factors here. If we, for example, thought that the price of raw materials was going to go up, if you're an airline, It's outside your control, but nevertheless, if the price of oil was going up and aviation fuel was going to go up, that can be a very critical success factor to you. You might be able to do anything about it short term, but long term, you would be thinking of fuel efficiency on your aircraft and so on. You'd be looking very closely at the profitability of each of the routes you're on and so on, because it's going to be important for you to make a profit on these flights despite the oil price being very, very high. Critical success factors, sometimes classified as internal or external. So an internal one, maybe how well we control our inventory, maybe how well we collect debts from our customers, maybe how well we recruit, retain and motivate individuals. External critical success factors could be like the oil example I gave for the aircraft. It could be exchange rates, it could be interest rates and so on. Just because it's a critical success factor doesn't mean we have got complete control over it, but it's certainly important to us, and we ideally will find some kind of way of managing it to some extent. And then they also divide into monitoring and building critical success factors. So a monitoring critical success factor is basically how we're doing now. It's looking at the actual versus the budget. And if we find that the cost per unit, that's a critical success factor, if it's creeping up beyond the budget, then we know it's important that we try to bring it down again to the budget to get that low cost per unit to allow us to generate the good profits. Or it could be a building critical success factor. So we know that maybe over the next 3 years we want to launch 3 new products. And we know that in the future it's going to be critical to our continued success that we get these products coming out on time, because if they're late it gives the opportunity for a competitor to get in and steal a big market share before we do that. So internal, external, a monitoring and a building critical success factors. Monitoring how we're doing now, building critical success factors, essential for how we're going to be doing in the future. Johnson and Scholes have a 6-step process for trying to identify critical success factors. So they said, first of all, identify factors that are critical to profitability. So this is not quite a critical success factor, this is a broader one. So the example I usually give is an airline. So a success factor that can be critical to an airline's profitability is the number of hours per day that an aircraft flies. Because when it's on the tarmac, it's not earning any money. So the more it's flying, then the more fair earning opportunities there are. One of the things they would identify with keeping it flying is to have a very short turnaround time. So it comes in, spends half an hour or something, takes off again. So you keep it in the air, maximum, you keep it in the tarmac, minimum. So turnaround time, this would be a critical competence really. And then what we have to do is to work on getting that turnaround time down. Develop a level of critical competence so that we obtain very short turnaround times. So, sort of thing typically airlines do, some of the budget ones, for example, some of them don't have little pouches on the back of seats to put magazines, because if there's no pouch, you can't put your crisp packets down there, so it doesn't require time or as much time to clean the aircraft. They maybe only allow one piece of hand luggage, so it's quick to put up, kind of quick to get down again, and so on. They require you to be at the gate, half an hour before the aeroplane is in, so that you're then kind of ready to kind of march on, rather than still perusing books in the bookshop or something of that type. They maybe come with their own steps built in, so the aircraft comes in, the steps come out and down. They don't have to wait for an air bridge or steps to be brought and so on. And they will be measuring how they do. They will be watching if fast turnaround times are important. they will develop a key performance indicator. So objectives are all measured. Critical success factors have what you would call key performance indicators. So they kind of match up: objectives, performance indicators, critical success factors, key performance indicators. They will be watching like a hawk the turnaround times. And if instead of being half an hour it's 45 minutes, they'll want an explanation as to why it was 45 minutes, and they will try to learn from what went wrong in that particular turnaround for the future. Ideally, you will have critical success factors which other people might find relatively difficult to copy, like buying planes with the built-in steps, for example. And then what you want to do is to never rest. You want to monitor your performance compared to competitors, because the competitors will be trying to always to overtake you, and if their critical success performance is better than yours, then you may have to up your game a little bit. Now, how do we know that an objective, or indeed a critical success factor, is reasonable? How do we know that a cost per unit, say, of $50 is okay, or a turnaround time of an aeroplane of 30 minutes is okay? It could be far too generous, it could be far too difficult to get. And this is where benchmarking comes in, and benchmarking is essentially comparisons. And the first sort of comparison you can do is an internal comparison. Now, to make it of any use at all, you can't just sit in a dark room and make up a figure. The internal comparison could be comparing to last year. So the turnaround time of the aircraft last year was averaging 30 minutes. Maybe this time we try for 25. It might be possible to make that improvement. Or if you had a string of shops, what you can do is maybe to compare the performance in one shop to performance in another. So if another shop has a particularly good performance in, say, stock shrinkage, stock being stolen, then it should be possible maybe for all of them to get down to that level. So internally, you have to compare to something really to give it legitimacy, either previous activities or previous levels of performance, or else you compare it to different branches, different divisions, so you can get a reasonable one. However, the problem is you are not competing against yourself. That's all very well saying that the turnaround time is 25 minutes. Last year it was 30 minutes, but if all the other aircraft got turnaround times of 20 minutes, that's not going to hack it. So what you really want is some sort of external benchmarking where you compare your performance with other similar organizations, because it's them you have to beat. Now that sounds fine in practice, but in theory rather, but in practice it's rather difficult, because in a way some of the most interesting stuff you want to benchmark is confidential. So you would dearly love to know what it costs a competitor to make a product, but I shouldn't think the competitor would want you to know what it costs to make a product, or how long it takes to make a product, and so on. So you're a little bit inhibited here in getting information that's actually relevant for this external benchmarking. And some organizations go to kind of extraordinary lengths. So you can be sure that, say, when an Apple iPad is launched or a new iPhone is launched, rival organizations will buy one of those and they will take it apart very carefully, and they'll lay out all the parts, and they'll be able to make a reasonable costing from those parts, and they'll make estimates about how long it took to put those parts together, because they see the way it was constructed, and they try to get kind of benchmarking information by that kind of reverse engineering of products. Best practice benchmarking, it can be the same organization but doesn't have to be. It's sometimes used to benchmark a particular aspect of organization's performance. So if we, for example, took a supermarket, now supermarkets are particularly, they're really masters of inventory. They know that a lot of their inventory is time limited, if you like. It kind of goes off. So it has to be sold within 2 days, 3 days, whatever the sell-by date is going to be. So there's a danger if you have too much inventory that it is going to have to be thrown out in some way. But if you've got too little inventory, then of course your shelves become bare, your customers get irritated that you don't have the stuff in stock. So they're very, very good at handling inventory in a very kind of accurate way. Now, take another organization completely different, but take, say, a hospital. And take a pharmacy in a hospital. Now, pharmaceuticals are to some extent similar to inventory in a supermarket. So they are. They have sell-by dates, use-by dates. Many of them kind of go off. They have to be often held in refrigerators, kind of chilled conditions and so on. It could be very dangerous if the pharmacy ran out of a particular drug that was desperately needed by a patient. So pharmacies actually have got considerable inventory management problems as well. What I'm saying is it might be possible for the pharmacy to look at some of the benchmark figures of a large supermarket and say, well, they only run out of inventory in 0.01% of all occasions, and they only have to throw out 2% of all inventory because it was overstocked and so on. Could we not get towards the same? What is, how could we raise our operations, improve our act, so to speak, so we get towards that? And because these are not competing, you might actually get a degree of cooperation. You wouldn't get one supermarket maybe telling another supermarket how it did it, but they might be cooperative with a completely separate sort of organisation, and in a way be able to teach them a few tricks of the trade as to how to keep very, very good inventory. And finally then there is comparability, where you compare the performance of businesses in quite different sectors. You have to be careful if they're in different sectors to what degree is there comparability kind of between them and so on. It's there, I think, more in theory than it is being used in practice. Having said benchmarks, there are potential problems with them. First of all, are they appropriate? In other words, are they tight enough, or are they too easy, or are they too tough, and so on there. They need to be used to improve performance. There's a danger that if somebody doesn't hit a benchmark, you kind of shout at them, really. And that's unlikely to actually improve performance. What we need here, they need to be used to improve the performance of people. They need to be used in a kind of supportive way. You didn't hit the ideal performance that time, but let's see how we can improve together. We can improve that to hit it. And finally, remember, whatever you measure, you change. And the corollary, as we said, when looking at objectives, presumably what you don't measure, you don't change. So we have benchmarks. They are turned into objectives. People will concentrate on those. And there is a real danger that things which aren't benchmarked, which don't have these externally kind of validated objectives there, they fall into, in a way, disrepute and disuse, because people can say, I don't believe it, you're not measuring it anyway, you're not measuring it properly, I'm just going to ignore it.